Hello and welcome. I am Scrapperlock, and this is City of Heroes on the Rebirth server. We are with our now level 43 Brute, Quintessence Lass, who has almost 14 million XP and needs about 2.5 million to get to a level 44 and our next superpower, 30 million influence. And we are on a story arc for Janet Kellum, who says, according to that ex-Crate programmer Howard Quigley, the Crate comp code was shared among 3 Crate facilities. You'll need to access a mainframe in each facility in order to get the entire body of code. So this is 3 missions, I believe, and so this may be spread over a couple of episodes, which is just fine. And before we do that, we'll stop when we get to the train station. I want to show you our enhancements. We've got a couple more. By the way, I haven't made any progress at all on reward merits because the last 2 weeks, when I have opened up the decks of cards for the veteran rewards, I've gotten 0 reward merits. I've been getting a bunch of crap like enhancement converters and enhancement boosters. Look at all that I don't use or need. So we haven't been able to do anything with sets. The last set that I wanted to get was something like Miracle or Doctored Wounds or one of those on Energize. And of course we wanted to get Touch of Death or whatever it is on Midnight Grasp. So there's still 2 more sets that I'd kind of like to do, especially Energize, but I don't know if we're going to be able to do that before level 50. It's looking less and less likely. So what we did last time was we finished Soul Drain. It now has a buff, a 2-hit buff on it. So when we apply it, we're going to get about a 14%, 15% buff rather than 12. It's a little bit better. Energize now does almost 50% heal, and focused accuracy now only uses just under 4/10 of an endurance per second, and that should help us in the endurance department. So as we go through these Cray missions, and let me just double check, we should be on +3 for this because I don't think we're going to be fighting Countess Cray anytime soon. We have 3 missions to do minimally before we get to her. So I'll just double check that and make sure that we are in the right difficulty, and we are +3 times 1. So as we go, I'd like to continue our discussion about kind of role-playing games, and in the last 2 episodes I talked about how not playing what it says in your character sheet is effectively cheating, and you shouldn't do that, and we talked about consent and that idea. I want to switch gears because the last 2 episodes we've been talking from the perspective of players and the player characters, and now what I want to do is actually talk about DMs cheating and why they generally shouldn't do it, but sometimes maybe they can and sometimes even should. So first let me explain what I'm talking about by Game Masters cheating. Some people might argue that they can't cheat because the GM is, sort of the deity of the world, and whatever the GM wants happens. I would argue that's not the proper way to GM. It should not be. Just like I always say with players, it's not all about you. It sure as heck isn't all about the GM either. So let's talk about the context. In this context, somebody had made an angry post to D&D Beyond. I think it was D&D Beyond. It might have been a Reddit post, but he was complaining that he had come up with this really cool plan to betray an NPC that was in the party, and it was a smart NPC. And he came up with this really cool, elaborate, intricate plan, and it turned out that the NPC was plotting against him while he was plotting against the NPC, and the NPC foiled his plan. Now, he said from the beginning he had been fully prepared for this not to work. He recognized that it might not. He recognized that it might go sideways. And he claimed he wasn't mad about that. But I guess he felt like the GM had used essentially metagaming, right? Using his GM's knowledge of the plan that the player told him to have the NPC make a counter plan that would prevent it, right? So this would be like, I don't know, I tell the Game Master that Quintessence Lass is going to stealth into this base, and the Game Master puts in anti-stealth devices all over the base and says, well, Cray has anti-stealth the base. Well, would Cray have done that if I had not told the Game Master that I was going to use stealth, right? And so as the debate went on, one of the people who answered the thread said, The problem is you're always going to have this doubt as to whether the GM created the plan. The GM claimed he had created the plan all along. Before even he knew what the player was going to do, he had this plan. And he said the problem is there's no way to know whether that was true, and you'll always have this nagging doubt. Did the GM essentially cheat? And I would argue that in fact it is cheating as a game master to use your knowledge of the plan that the players have come up with out of earshot of the villains and just have the villains know the plan. You shouldn't do that. There were a lot of plans being made by my party in the Shrine of the Kuo-toa, and I did not take what they told me and alter the Kuo-toa plans. Okay? And it would not have been right to do that. When they decided they wanted to go in a certain direction, I didn't throw a bunch of guards in that direction. I had all the guards on the map ahead of time, and those guards were where they are. And I had the shift changes written down, and I had, for each guard post, how they were going to react if attacked, right? And certain guards were going to fight, other guards were going to go and get help. And I even labeled, like, which room they would go to get help. By the way, I didn't actually make most of this up. It was mostly written by Gary Gygax in the module, and I just transferred it to my game. Now, what I will say I did, and I think this isn't cheating, this is prep. When they were emailing back and forth and they decided they wanted to do this one particular plan, I said, okay, now that I know the plan, I went into the module the afternoon before we played, and I just read up on the areas they were intending to go first and made sure I knew what my notes said the Kuo-toa would do when attacked or when they encounter so-called warm bloods, right? I didn't try to counter what the players were doing. I just tried to put into my brain, like I studied, what the Kuo-toa are going to do so that I wouldn't have to stop in the middle of the session and say, hold on, guys, let me read this page of notes. Right? And I think that's a perfectly valid thing to do. That's not cheating, right? That's prepping. It's making sure that you're prepared for what the players are going to come up with, right? And I think that that's perfectly fine. But what wouldn't have been okay if they said, we're going to go down the west corridor, and I throw a bunch of extra guards in the west corridor as if the Kuo-toa know they're coming. There's no way the Kuo-toa could have known they were coming. And as a GM, you have to be fair. You're a ref between NPCs who have no player and the player characters, right? You aren't the monsters. They're not your characters. You're the ref between these characters who have no player and the player characters. And so you have to be fair about it. So when it comes to sort of cheating as a game master, you should never use the knowledge you have to give the NPCs or the monsters knowledge they wouldn't have had if they weren't being played by the DM, because they're not supposed to be played by the DM. They're just run by the DM because they have no player. And that's a very subtle but very important difference. Now, with that said, there are all kinds of times when it's okay for the game master to cheat. It is commonly accepted that game masters have every right to fudge die rolls. Now, I generally try not to do it. I've done it maybe twice in my campaign. I would argue that the only time a GM should ever fudge die rolls is to help the players, right? You fudge die rolls so you don't kill the level 1 character, or you fudge die rolls so that you don't kill off the NPC, the dependent NPC, Lois Lane, right? Superman tries to, throw himself in front of the bullet and fails his dex roll. And so the bullet is going to hit Lois Lane, right? And it's a 3d6 killing attack, and you roll triple sixes, and it does 18 body, and she's only got 7 body left, and it's going to kill her. As a GM, you fake it, right? You don't just kill off Lois Lane. That's, technically cheating. It's fudging the die rolls. I would argue that's a perfectly acceptable way to do something. You don't want to force Superman to mourn Lois Lane or buy off his dependent NPC. He didn't do anything wrong. In fact, he did everything right, and the dice just went against him. In a case like that, because the dice are not sentient and they can't tell what makes a good dramatic story, Matt Colville talks about this. The dice cannot create drama, and they don't know when rolling badly is going to ruin the drama of the moment. And so if the drama calls for a certain success, you can allow it. But I would argue never in a way that is harming the characters, right? I don't ever fudge die rolls so that the bad guy makes a save or hits a character or does extra damage. I never ever do that. The only time I've ever fudged die rolls is to weaken it for the bad guys, right? So it was about like maybe a month ago, and we were in a tough battle, and again, this was when I attacked the new player's character, and she'd been hit a couple times, and so her hit points were pretty far down, and I think she would have been okay, but I didn't want to like drop her to 1 or 2 hit points, and so I think I rolled like it was like 2d8 plus 6 or something, and I rolled double 8s, and I just changed it to the average damage, right? There's a printed average damage. I just used the average roll, right? And I think that is, again, technically quote unquote cheating in the sense it's faking the roll, but it's not cheating against the player characters and cheating in favor of her so that her gnome wouldn't get face planted. Again, I don't think that that's a problem. So cheating to help the party a little bit. I mentioned another time when I cheated, she made a perception roll to see like this journal entry that I really wanted them to find because it was actually really important to the story, and she rolled like an 8 total, and the DC was 10. It was an easy DC, but she still failed it, and I just said, well, you see this, and like instead of telling her she saw a scroll, I said, you see something behind the table leg. You're not sure what it is. And then she moved the table leg and found it, right? Again, that wasn't cheating like to help her. That was cheating for another reason that I think is valid as a GM. It was cheating to move the story along, for narrative purposes. And again, I think everybody recognizes a game master's prerogative to alter the results, to move the story along, or to benefit the narrative in some way. Maybe the battle's really boring, so you just have the monsters run off. You say, I'm going to make a morale check for them, and you just roll, and whatever it says, you say, okay, they failed, and they run off. Battle's boring, we're getting tired of the battle. We need to move the story along. There's no point to, fighting these last 5 guys, so I'll just have them run off. I would argue that kind of thing isn't really cheating, right? That's the GM making kind of an executive decision as the game master, saying, at this point, we need to move the story along, right? And I'm going to move the story along in my prerogative as a game master, right? So I think to move the narrative along, to move the story along, to help the players, all of those are perfectly good reasons why a game master should quote-unquote cheat or could cheat, right? Speeding up the session, improving the narrative, helping the players succeed, preventing making sure a character doesn't faceplant when at the beginning of a battle and then be bored all night while the rest of the battle is going on. These are all valid reasons why a game master might, go against the dice or even the rules to try and kind of keep the session going and make sure that everybody's having fun, right? So it's perfectly acceptable for the GM to cheat, violate the rules, fudge the dice, to help everybody have fun. That's the GM's job. But as a GM, using your knowledge of the player's plan to alter the NPC behavior so the NPCs can beat the players, that's not helping anybody have fun, right? That is taking a mentality of you against the players and you're trying to beat them, right? So then I would say that is cheating and you shouldn't do it, right? GM shouldn't metagame any more than players do, right? And metagaming is allowing the character to use knowledge the character wouldn't have in character, right? So the game master may know that you have 10 hit points, but the enemy shouldn't know that. The game master might know that you have a 15 deception score or whatever, like you have a high deception score, but the NPC shouldn't know that. The game master might know you cast a spell, but unless the NPC has some way of knowing it, they shouldn't just know it because the GM does. And that's metagaming just as badly if players do it, and there are DMs who metagame. And I think it's very hard as a GM to it's hard to not know what you know, right? It's actually very difficult. Um, it's sort of like the old analogy I said a while back of the scene in Everybody Loves Raymond where Raymond says to his brother, "It's like that's like saying don't think about zebras, go," right? As soon as he says that, you're going to think of zebras. And saying, don't think about the armor class of this hero or whatever. Yeah, you can't not know it. But you have to be objective enough as the GM to say, well, okay, I may know that this guy has a high armor class, but how would anybody else know? In fact, there was even a conversation on D&D Beyond, I think it was. It might have been a Reddit. I think it was D&D Beyond. Again, I keep forgetting where I read these, where somebody was talking about, sort of how to fight this very effective party, and he came up with this idea of this giant basilisk. I think it's one from the Wildmount supplement that lives in the water, and it would attack this guy, and it would pull him under the water and do this and do that. And I looked up the stats of this thing, and it's got a 3 intelligence. And I and one of the other GMs was like, we were like, how would it be smart enough to know who to attack? Like, it should attack the spellcasters first. What is a 3 intelligence, basically giant crocodile, know about spellcasters? This isn't an orc who can recognize spellcasting when it sees it, right? This is basically an alligator. The alligator is just going to attack whatever's nearest and whatever's the most vulnerable to it. It might be able to clock, and there's a Paragon Protector, so we're going to have to run away from him when he turns on his super ability. But that's fine. An alligator might be able to clock somebody in metal armor, right, and recognize that the guy in metal armor is going to be much harder to hurt, right, than the guy who's just wearing clothing. But I said, for instance, I don't think the basilisk should be able to tell the difference between cloth and leather armor, because it would all just look like, hides or clothing to it, right? Especially if the armor is dyed or decorated or you're wearing a cloak over it. And a big giant knight, covered in armor might be obviously defensive, but that's not going to be the same as, say, leather armor or cloth armor, a mage armor, shield, and so forth. He's now turned on his ability, so we'll switch to the other guy. I'm just going to find other guys to fight here, and, we know that guy won't be hittable for a little while. So how would a basilisk know who's the vulnerable person? Who to hit first? It shouldn't, right? That's metagaming. That's the GM having a monster use knowledge the monster shouldn't have about the abilities of the player characters that only the GM should know and the other player characters. And you shouldn't do that either, right? So yeah, that would make the basilisk be more of a threat. Sure. I'm just not fighting these guys. They're just ridiculous. It would make the basilisk be more of a threat, certainly. But it's an unrealistic threat, because a basilisk is not intelligent, and a basilisk isn't going to know who the vulnerable members of the party are. It's not going to know who's a spellcaster. It's not going to know who uses ranged weapons before the battle starts, who uses ranged weapons and who uses melee weapons. It's not going to know any of that. The DM knows it. The basilisk doesn't. And so, again, that's metagaming. It's cheating. You shouldn't use your knowledge as a GM against the party, right? What you're using is your knowledge as a GM to come up with a realistic reaction from the monsters to what the players are doing. And so you do what the monsters would do. You have them do what they would do. So, for example, if you go back and listen to my Shrine of the Kuo-toa discussion and how the players have kind of brought the whole complex down on them, what I said initially when the first Kuo-toa monitor, who's a monk, went off to alert the guard room, he alerted one guard room that there were Warmbloods in the compound. He just brought one guard room full of about 15 guys, one detachment of troops to deal with it, right? And if the players had played their cards right, they could have defeated that detachment of troops and they would have been fine. He didn't. There was another guard room next to this one. He didn't bring them. Why? Because in his knowledge, in his experience, the Kuo-toa, a group of 15 Kuo-toa are more than enough to handle a group of 4 or 5 surface dwellers who can't see in the dark and generally don't have any abilities to protect themselves against the attacks of the Kuo-toa, and they can get some victims for their shrine and sacrifice to their god, right? So the Kuo-toa have no experience with a party of high-level adventurers, right? There aren't that many 7th level characters in the entire world, and none of them have ever come into the shrine of the Kuo-toa. So the Kuo-toa are used to just fighting fishermen and stuff like that, and they think these guys are going to be cream puffs. 15 Kuo-toa, maybe that's overkill, right? Now, as a GM, I know they're going to need 3 or 4 guard rooms worth of Kuo-toa to be able to fight these guys, but the Kuo-toa don't know that. And it wouldn't be fair for me to have them just magically know and bring 3 guard rooms worth of guards to fight the players. Later on, when the players were chasing one detachment of troops down the hall, and I said they saw a couple of guards and they were looking curiously in that direction, those guards weren't ready to get involved at that point, right? Even though tactically they should have, right? Because they didn't know what was happening yet. And then what did the players do? They let loose with a fireball in sight of those guards. Okay, now that alerts the guards. Now they know this is dangerous, right? Fireball is a higher level spell than pretty much anything they're used to, right? There are a couple of equivalent to about 6th or 7th level clerics and a couple of 6th or 7th level monks, and there's a 10th level cleric that's the priest prince, and that's it. So when they start seeing fireballs go off, they know this is a dangerous group that's equal to their most powerful guys, right? So now they're going to bring a lot more guards. But they didn't bring the guards just because the party was high level and I, as a GM, knew it. They brought the extra guards after the characters did something to alert them to how powerful they are, right? So I'm thinking the whole time, okay, what are the Kuo-toa going to do? So as a GM, you have to separate yourself from being a GM to think like the monsters and think, what would they know and how would they react to it? This isn't any different from my best friend who, when he saw a sketch of what I'm sure he realized was the planes in the temple at 4th level, he said, out of character, okay, well, I know what this is, but my character wouldn't, so I'm not going to say any more. Right? That is the correct way to roleplay. His character did not know this was a sketch of the planes, so he didn't have his character say, oh, these are the planes. And he didn't even tell the other players, I think mostly because of the new player, right? And he didn't want to spoil it for her. Let her discover on her own that these are the planes of existence, and it'll be more fun for her. Right? But as a character, he also didn't know this material, and he shouldn't be blathering about it as if he does, right? And so it's the same thing. What do the Kuo-toa know, and how are they going to react based on what they know, not based on what I as a GM know? So you might be asking yourself, right? It's one thing as a player character, you're just playing one guy, but when you're playing all these different monsters, some are smart, some are dumb, some may know more than others. As a GM, how do you censor yourself? How do you regulate yourself? How do you make sure that you're doing it right and you're not accidentally maybe allowing a little of your knowledge as a GM to bleed over into what you do? That depends on the game master, but I will tell you my technique. And my technique is I write things down ahead of time, right? As I described, I had written, based on Gary Gygax, I had written what the different Kuo-toa types of guards would do in each circumstance if they found themselves in combat with a powerful force of enemies, right? I said they're going to go to the nearest guard room, let's say. And then for each group, I looked at, for each guard that was a sentry, I looked at, okay, where is the nearest guard room? So when the one sentry saw them and ran off, I knew exactly which room he was supposed to go to because I had already written it down, right? And so it's almost like writing a little computer algorithm, some computer code. You're just doing the algorithm manually, where you say, if they do something, guards do this. If they do this other thing, the guards do that. Right? And so I had a bunch of contingencies. You can't know everything, and if you write down contingencies A, B, C, and D, the players will absolutely do E and F, which you weren't ready for. But because you wrote down some contingencies, you have an idea of how the monsters will act, and then you can just sort of extrapolate from there, which makes you less likely to accidentally allow that knowledge that you have to bleed over from your DMing into the behavior of the monsters. So I encourage people to make notes, prep, and get ready for the adventure, and always write down kind of the standard operating procedures, or SOP, of the monsters. Okay, the standard operating procedure of this thing. So for instance, the priest prince who runs this entire shrine, it's written in there, he's a friggin' coward. He has some invisibility and stealth powers, and if the players come into his chamber, he's sort of bathing in his little pool, because these are fish people. He's got 2 guards, 2 monks who guard him. He'll let the guards fight, and he's going to run away, right? And there's a secret room in the back, and he's going to sneak into that secret room, and they may see the door open and close, but then they're going to have to figure out how to get in there. And he's going to run and hide. Now, if they corner him, it says he will fight. Right, so if they find the way into his secret room and he's trapped in there and he can't get out, he'll probably try to stay invisible and hope they don't see him. But if they reach around and they touch every wall and they eventually blunder into him and start attacking him, he will fight back. But he's always going to look for a way to just disengage and run away. And he actually has a legendary ability. I can't remember what it's called, but it's basically he can turn invisible for 1 round. And once he's invisible, then after he can move without provoking opportunity attacks. If they like get into the room and there's a way for him to go past them, get out the secret door and go hide somewhere else, he'll freaking do it. He's a coward, and I wrote that down in his character sheet. Actually, Gary Gygax wrote that down. Right? I expanded on it. He just said the guy's a coward and he'll run away. I then added more detail for myself to help me adjudicate what he's actually going to do. But he's a freaking coward, and he's going to run, right? And that fact is going to help me run him. So now, the players are going to probably, at this point, if they encounter him, the odds are very high that they're going to be drained of their resources. The odds are extremely high that the player characters are going to be out of their high-level spells, out of some of their low and mid-level spells, maybe only have a few first-level spells and cantrips left, right? They may be beaten up and bloodied. So he will be more than a match for them if they're drained of resources. He's not going to be a match for them if they're at full strength. But he doesn't know that they're drained of resources. He might be able to see they're a little beaten up. But again, he is a coward. He would never take the chance that they're maybe faking their injuries, making them look worse, or they have more magic items than he realizes, because he's got a lot of magic items in his treasure trove, so he knows all about magic items. So if they walk into his room beaten up, he's still going to run away. Now, as a GM, I know he can win this fight because he's a legendary creature and they're wounded and out of resources. But he doesn't know how wounded they are or how out of resources they are. And consequently, he's going to run away any chance he gets. That's what it says in my notes, right? That's his behavior. He's a freaking coward. So I'm going to make sure that he's played the way it says. And so the fact that I wrote this down and I decided it long before they ever, I mean, this was weeks ago, before they ever even decided to go into the shrine. He was already written, and I already knew he was a coward. So he's going to act that way no matter what they do. Unless they, let's say, walked into the room blatantly talking in a language he understood about just how tired and beaten up they all are and how they don't think they can even do one more fight. You know, then he would know. But I think because he's such a coward, he'd run away anyway. Because again, he wouldn't trust it. He'd be afraid they were lying or trying to lure him into the into a battle that he can't win, right? And he's again, he's a coward. So so again, as a GM, you have a lot of knowledge that the players that the NPCs would not have, right? About the player characters. You're not allowed to let the NPCs use that knowledge when they shouldn't have access to it. As a GM, that's a very bad way to play, because it's like it's making you be an opponent of the players, and you're trying to beat them. And that's not the goal of a GM. You're not trying to beat them, right? Matt Koval has a great video in which he talks about one of his players said something about him trying to kill them or whatever, and he said, "I'm not trying to kill your character. The monsters are trying to kill your character. I'm just adjudicating it, right? And I'm playing the monsters as fairly as I can. But I don't want to kill your character. The monsters do." And that should be the attitude of the GM. You shouldn't want to kill the player characters, but you should recognize that the monsters do, and you should adjudicate the monsters' movements and choices in combat and out of combat to help the monsters survive, right? They want to live, and they want to beat the player characters. And it's okay to have them be smart and do things that would help them live and beat the player characters, as long as they're only acting on the knowledge they would realistically have. They're not allowed to act on knowledge that you have as GM, but they wouldn't have. Right? Here's another example of kind of, I don't want to call it cheating, but I have, as I've mentioned, there are these deep gnomes who are friendly with the party, and one of them can walk through walls and grab people and bring them through walls. And if the players are defeated, probably... Oh, am I being ambushed? If the players are defeated... Oh, Malta's coming after me now. That's interesting. If the players are defeated in this big battle that we're having next week, they're going to probably be captured. I pretty much decided I'm going to do that. Because the Kuo-toa it would just intend to kill them later, not now. They want to sacrifice them to their god. So they'll probably be captured. And they're going to be put in a prison, in like a cell, in a cave. And the deep gnomes, the deep gnome leader, I'm going to say, like, you see these eyes in the wall. I've mentioned this before. The deep gnome leader is going to come out and try to get them out of there and bring them to a safe place from which they can go back to Rome, right? Go back to the city. And then they'll have to decide what they want to do about this shrine, whether they want to try to get the army to come back or what have you. And if they want to do that, we can do that as well. That's quote-unquote kind of cheating, because they should have died, but I'm going to try to help them be captured instead of dying. Again, it's okay to cheat like that as a GM. It's just not okay to say, I'm going to kill the character, and I'm going to roll damage and roll max no matter what, because I want this character to die. That, you're not allowed, you really shouldn't be doing as a GM. Unless the player has said to you, I want my character to die, then you can do it. But if you're just rolling dice or something, you shouldn't be fudging the dice to harm the players. The whole point of GMing is to give the players a pleasurable and fun experience. And they're not going to be having fun if you're picking on them or trying to twist events so that you can beat them. It's not you against them. It's you trying to help them have a fun, challenging evening or afternoon of play. So always remember that. And if you're going to fudge or cheat, always do it to help the story, help the narrative, or help the party, and never to defeat the party. All right, we have another one of these to go to, but we've already gotten through a half hour, so we're going to stop here. Until next time, folks, I am Scrapalock, and this has been the City of Heroes on the Rebirth server.